Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we travel high into the mountains of South America, into the thin, cold air of the Andes, and into the world of the Inca. Tonight is a slow gathering of small, quiet facts about their empire, their mountains, their roads, their gods, and the great stone cities they left behind. There is nothing to solve here, only a gentle walk through a lost world, one soft fact at a time, until sleep arrives on its own. Let us begin high in the mountains, where the empire lived. The Inca built their world along the spine of the Andes, the long mountain range that runs down the western edge of South America. It is one of the longest mountain ranges on Earth, and the Inca made their home among its highest valleys and peaks, in places where the air is thin and the clouds drift below the villages rather than above them. The people we call the Inca did not call their empire by that name. They called it Tawantinsuyu, a word often understood to mean the four regions joined together, or the land of the four quarters. The empire was imagined as four great parts, four suyus, spreading out in four directions from a single center. That center was the city of Cusco. Its name is often said to mean the navel of the world, the center point from which everything else radiated. From Cusco, the four regions of the empire stretched outward, and every road, in a sense, led home to it. At its height, the empire of the Inca was enormous. It stretched for thousands of miles along the mountains and the coast, from the high deserts in the south to the green highlands in the north, across what is today parts of Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, and Colombia. It was the largest empire ever built in the Americas before the arrival of Europeans. And yet, in some ways, the empire was young when it fell. The Inca had lived in the Cusco Valley for a long time as one small people among many, but their great expansion, the swift growth that made them masters of the mountains, happened within about a single century. A vast empire rose in only a few generations. The Inca did not build their world from nothing. They rose at the end of a very long story. For the Andes had been home to great cultures for thousands of years before them. Earlier, Peoples had already built cities, raised temples, terraced the mountains, woven fine cloth, and worked gold long before the Inca came to power. Near Lake Titicaca stood the ruins of an older sacred city, already ancient and abandoned when the Inca knew it, whose great stonework they admired and whose gods they honored. Along the northern coast, a rich and powerful kingdom of skilled goldsmiths and builders had flourished until the Inca conquered it and carried its craftsmen back to Cusco to work for the empire. Much of what we think of as Inca, the terraces, the roads, the fine weaving, the working of gold, was gathered and inherited from those who came before, then organized and spread on a scale the Andes had never seen. The Inca were, in a sense, the great gatherers and organizers of a wisdom already old. The word Inca, strictly speaking, referred first to the ruler and the ruling family, not to all the people. The emperor himself was called the Sapa Inca, which is often understood to mean the sole ruler or the only Inca. Over time, the name came to describe the whole civilization, but at its heart it named a single sacred king. The Sapa Inca was believed to be far more than a man. He was thought to be descended from the sun itself, a living son of the sun god. Because of this, he was treated with enormous reverence. People were said to lower their eyes in his presence and to carry small burdens on their backs as a sign of humility when they approached him. The life of the Sapa Inca was surrounded with splendor and with careful ritual. He was carried from place to place upon a litter, a seat borne on the shoulders of chosen men, so that his feet need not touch the common road. Fine cloth was woven for him and, it is said, was often worn only once before being set aside, for garments touched by the sacred person of the emperor were not treated as ordinary things. Attendants cared for his every need, and he ate from vessels of gold and silver and drank from golden cups, living amid a household of great richness. To the people, he was not merely a king, but a sacred presence, the living child of the sun walking among them. The Inca traced their beginnings to a founding story, as many peoples do, and their story began at a lake, high in the mountains. On the border of what is now Peru and Bolivia lies Lake Titicaca, one of the highest large lakes in the world, a vast sheet of deep blue water sitting far. above the level of the distant sea. From this lake, the story says, came the first Inca. The creator sent a man named Manco Capac and a woman named Mama Oclo, often called a brother and sister and husband and wife, up out of the waters of Lake Titicaca to bring order and civilization to the world. They carried with them a golden staff, and they were told to travel until they found the place where the staff would sink into the ground. They wandered through the mountains, testing the earth as they went, and at last, in the valley of Cusco, the golden staff sank easily into the soil. There they stopped, and there they founded their city. Manco Capac was remembered as the first Sapa Inca, the founder of the royal line. He was said to have taught the people how to farm and how to build, while Mama Oclo taught the women how to weave and to spin. In this way, the founding of the empire was tied to the two things the Inca valued most deeply: the growing of food and the making of cloth. There was another founding story told as well, and in it, the first Inca did not rise from the lake, but came out of the earth. In this telling, several brothers and their sisters emerged from a cave at a place remembered as the Inn of Dawn, and set out together to find a home. They were beings of great power, and not all of them reached the end of the journey. One brother was so strong and so unruly that the others came to fear him, and they tricked him into returning to a cave and sealed the entrance with a great stone, closing him away. Another was said to have turned to stone upon a sacred hill along the way. In the end, it was Manco Capac who led the remaining people down into the valley of Cusco, and there they settled and began the city. The Inca kept both of these stories, the lake and the cave, and honored the places in both as sacred. Origins, for them, were holy ground. For many generations after Manco Capac, the Inca remained a modest people, one kingdom among the many that filled the Andes. Then came a ruler who changed everything, remembered as one of the greatest figures in their history. His name was Pachacuti. The name Pachacuti is often understood to mean something like earth shaker, or he who overturns the world, and that is nearly what he did. Under his rule, the Inca began their great expansion, conquering and absorbing their neighbors, spreading outward from Cusco across the mountains in every direction. The rise of Pachacuti was tied to a moment of great danger before he became emperor. A powerful rival people called the Chanca marched against Cusco, and the reigning Inca and his chosen heir were said to have fled the city, believing it already lost. But the young prince, who would become Pachacuti, refused to abandon Cusco. He gathered what defenders he could, and he stood to fight. In the stories told afterward, it was said that at the height of the battle, the very stones of the field rose up as warriors to fight beside him, and that he had been given a vision of the Creator God promising him victory. Whether one hears these as miracles or as the way a great victory is remembered and adorned, the outcome was the same. Pachacuti defeated the Chanca and saved the city, and from that day the small kingdom of Cusco began its swift transformation into an empire. It was as though the whole future of the Inca turned upon that single refusal to run. Pachacuti was not only a conqueror, he was remembered as a great builder and organizer, the one who rebuilt Cusco into a grand imperial capital, and who was connected in tradition to the building of the mountain estate we now know as Machu Picchu. Much of what made the empire great was tied to his long and powerful reign. After Pachacuti came his son, often called Topa Inca, who pushed the empire's borders even further, southward and northward along the mountains, until the roads of the Inca stretched across thousands of miles. And after him came Huayna Capac, under whom the empire reached perhaps its greatest size, its cities full, its storehouses stocked, its roads busy with travelers. From Manco Capac down to the last emperors, the Inca counted a line of rulers, remembered by name and by deed, each a link in the sacred descent from the sun. The earliest of them belong half to history and half to legend, their stories softened by the passing of time. The later ones, Pachacuti and his son and his grandson, are the great empire builders whose reigns are more clearly remembered. Together, they formed a single unbroken royal line, father to son across the generations. Each new Sapa Inca taking up the fringe of red wool upon his brow that marked him as the ruler of all the four regions. The growth of the empire was carried, in part, on the strength of the Inca armies. Though the Inca often preferred to win, without a battle if they could, when they came to a new people, they would frequently offer peace first, with gifts and with promises, inviting them to join the empire and to share in its order and its full storehouses. Many chose to join, rather than to fight. For those who resisted, the Inca brought war. Their warriors fought with slings that could hurl stones with great force, with clubs and maces tipped with heads of stone or bronze, sometimes shaped like a star, and with spears and axes. They wore quilted padding and carried shields, and they moved in large, disciplined companies raised through the labor tax from across the empire. When a people was brought into the empire, the Inca did not simply destroy them. They folded them in. Local lords were often left in place if they submitted. Their sons sometimes brought to Cusco to be raised and educated and to serve as gentle hostages. The sacred images of conquered peoples might be carried to Cusco as well, honored and watched over, and held quietly to ensure good behavior. The empire grew not only by conquering, but by absorbing, binding new peoples into its roads, its language, and its worship of the sun. To hold such an empire together across such distances, the Inca built one of the most remarkable road systems in all of history. It was called the Capac Ñan, the Great Road, or the Royal Road. Its many branches together are often said to have stretched for tens of thousands of miles through the mountains and along the coast. These roads climbed over high passes, crossed deserts, and wound along the edges of deep valleys where the land was steep. The Inca built stone stairways into the mountainsides where the ground was wet. They raised the road on causeways. The roads were built to last, and parts of them can still be walked today, centuries later. The Inca did not have horses, and they did not use wheels for transport. So the roads were made for people traveling on foot and for llamas carrying loads. Yet across these footpaths, messages could travel with astonishing speed, faster than one might expect in a world without wheels or horses. This was because of the Shaski, the relay runners of the empire. Young men were stationed in small posts along the roads, waiting. When a message came, a runner would carry it at full speed to the next post, where a fresh runner was ready to take it onward. In this way, messages were passed from runner to runner, hour after hour, day and night. Through this relay of running messengers, news and orders could travel across hundreds of miles in only a few days. It is even said that fresh fish could be carried up from the distant coast to the emperor in the mountains, passed from runner to runner while it was still fresh. The empire's nerves ran along its roads on the legs. of young men along the great roads at regular distances. The Inca built way stations called tambos. These were places where travelers on official business could rest, find shelter, and take food and supplies. The tambos were spaced roughly a day's journey apart, so that no traveler need spend a night in the open. The great road system had two main lines running the length of the empire from north to south, one following the high spine of the mountains and one running along the coast below, with many smaller roads crossing between them like the rungs of a ladder. Along these routes moved travelers, llama caravans, and running messengers, and the roads were kept clean and in good repair by the people of each region as part of their labor to the state. The roads were not for wandering. They were for the ordered business of the empire, and to travel them at all was itself a kind of service. Where the roads met the deep gorges of the mountains, the Inca built bridges, and among the most remarkable were their suspension bridges woven from grass. Thick cables were braided from a tough mountain grass, anchored on either side of a canyon, and a walkway was hung between them high, above the rushing rivers below. These grass bridges had to be rebuilt regularly, for the grass would weaken over time. Whole communities would gather to weave new cables and replace the old bridge in a great cooperative effort. One such bridge is still rebuilt this way today, each year by the descendants of the people who first made it, using the same methods passed down through the centuries. Now, here is one of the most surprising facts about the Inca. They ruled this vast and highly organized empire, with its roads and its cities and its armies, without any system of writing as we usually understand it. They kept no books, no letters, no carved inscriptions of words. Instead, the Inca kept their records on knotted cords called quipu. A quipu was made of a main cord, with many smaller strings hanging from it, and into these strings were tied knots of different kinds, in different positions, in cords of different colors. The knots and their positions could record numbers using a system based on tens, so that a single quipu could hold the results of a census, the contents of a storehouse, the amount of tribute owed, or the size of a herd. The Inca counted and recorded the affairs of their whole empire on these bundles of colored string. There were trained specialists whose task was to make and to read the quipu, officials who could look at a bundle of knotted cords and recite what it recorded. They were the record keepers of the empire, and their knotted strings were its ledgers and its archives, carried and stored and consulted like documents. Much of what the quipu recorded was numerical, the careful accounting of a well-ordered state, but many believe the chords could carry more than numbers, perhaps names, histories, and stories as well, encoded in ways not fully understood today. Some of their secrets were lost when the empire fell, and the full reading of the quipu remains a puzzle even now. The Inca administration was built upon careful counting, and it was organized in a decimal way, in units based on tens. Families were grouped into tens, and tens of tens, and larger groups still, each with its own leader responsible to the one above. In this way, the whole population could be counted, organized, and directed from the top down to know their people fully. The Inca sorted the whole population into groups by age and ability, from the smallest children to the eldest of the old. Each stage of life carried its own expected tasks, light work for the very young and the aged, the full labor of the fields and the roads, for those in their strength. In this way, the state knew not merely how many people it had, but what each of them could do, and could call upon the right hands for every task. The Inca held censuses, counting their people and their resources, so that the state always knew what it had and what it could ask for. This constant accounting was one of the secrets of their power. An empire that knows exactly what it possesses can plan and store and provide. To govern so many people, the Inca built a ladder of officials reaching from the emperor down to the smallest village. The local lords of conquered peoples were often kept on to rule their own communities under the empire's watch. Above the households stood officials responsible for small groups of families, and above them, officials responsible for larger groups still, each answering to the one above, all the way up to the 4 great lords of the 4 regions, who answered only to the Sapa Inca himself. The empire also sent out inspectors who travelled the land to see that all was as it should be. Officials whose title is often understood to mean he who sees all. They checked the storehouses, the fields, and the conduct of the local lords, and reported back to the centre. Little was meant to escape the eye of the state. The Inca were remembered for firm order and for a few simple commands that ran through their society, often given as 3 short rules. Do not steal, do not lie, do not be lazy. In a world where the state provided for those in genuine need, and where idleness weakened the whole community. These were not only morals, but something like the very glue of the empire. The economy of the Inca worked in a way very different from the buying and selling most of the world knows. There were no coins, no money, and no great marketplaces at the heart of the system. Wealth was not counted in cash, for there was none. Instead, the empire ran on labor and on obligation. The great tax that people owed was not money, but work. This labor tax was called the mita. For part of each year, people gave their labor to the state, building roads, farming state lands, working in mines, serving in the army, or helping to raise great buildings. In exchange for this labor, the state took on the duty of caring for the people. It stored food against times of hunger, provided for those who worked on its projects, and supported the old, the sick, and the widowed. It was a system of exchange, labor flowing upward, care flowing back down. Across the empire, the Inca built provincial centers, smaller reflections of Cusco set at key points along the roads. Each might have its own temple to the sun, its own house of chosen women, its own great storehouses, its own plaza for ceremony, and its own quarters for officials and travelers. In this way, the order of the capital was carried outward and repeated across the land, so that the presence of the empire, its gods, its granaries, and its administration was felt in every region. Wherever the roads reached, a small piece of Cusco was planted. At the heart of daily life was the Elu, the community of families bound together by kinship and by shared land. People belonged to their Elu, worked its fields together, and helped one another through the seasons. The Elu was the basic building block of Inca society, older than the empire itself. Andean life was woven through with the idea of reciprocity, of giving and receiving in balance. Neighbors helped one another plant and harvest, knowing the help would be returned. Even the relationship between the people and their gods, and between the people and their rulers, was imagined as a kind of exchange, offerings given, blessings and care received in return. To feed the empire, the Inca collected and stored vast amounts of food in buildings called kolka. the storehouses of the state. These were often built in long rows on cool hillsides, where the mountain air helped keep the food from spoiling. They were filled with grain, dried potatoes, and other supplies. These storehouses held enough to feed armies on the march, to supply workers on great projects, and to keep whole regions alive through times of drought or crop failure. The careful storing of food was one of the quiet foundations of Inca power, a wall against hunger built out of full granaries. And what filled those storehouses came from one of the most remarkable farming traditions in the world. For the Inca were master farmers of the high mountains. Growing food on steep slopes at great heights is difficult, and the Inca met the challenge by reshaping the mountains themselves. They built terraces, wide, flat steps cut into the mountainsides and held in place by stone walls. These terraces turned steep slopes into level fields, caught and held the rain and the soil, and allowed crops to grow where bare mountainside would have washed away. Whole hillsides were carved into these green staircases of farmland. The terraces did more than simply flatten the land. Their stone walls soaked up the warmth of the sun during the day and released it slowly through the cold mountain nights, protecting the plants from frost. Each terrace was a little world with its own climate, carefully made. The Inca and their Andean ancestors grew an astonishing variety of crops, but none was more important than the potato. The potato came originally from the high Andes, and the peoples of the mountains grew it in a bewildering number of kinds, in many colors and shapes and sizes, each suited to a different soil or height or use. There were said to be thousands of varieties of potato in the Andes, far more than most of the world has ever seen. Some were grown for one purpose, some for another, a whole living library of potatoes, kept and passed down and carefully tended by mountain farmers over countless generations. The Inca even found a way to preserve the potato for long storage through a clever use of their cold mountain climate. They would leave potatoes out in the freezing night air, then let them thaw and be trodden underfoot. In the day, to press out the water, repeating this over several days. The result was a light, dry, long-lasting food called chuño, a freeze-dried potato that could be kept for years without spoiling. It was one of the foods that filled the great storehouses, a way of holding the harvest safe against the future. In a sense, The Inca had discovered freeze-drying high in their mountains. Long ago, alongside the potato, the Inca grew maize, the tall grain we call corn, which was especially valued and often grown on the best irrigated land in the warmer valleys. Maize was food, but it was also more than food, for from it was brewed the drink that filled their festivals. That drink was chicha, a kind of beer made from maize, mildly fermented, cloudy and pale. Chicha was drunk at feasts and ceremonies and shared in great quantities at celebrations. It was poured out as an offering to the gods and the earth as well, a drink that belonged to both the living and the sacred. The Inca also grew quinoa, a small hardy grain that thrives in the thin air and cold of the high mountains where other grains cannot. Quinoa was a staple of the highlands, nourishing and resilient, one of the foods that made life possible at such heights. They grew beans, squash, peppers, and many other plants as well, and in the warmer lowlands, fruits and cotton, the Andean world, stacked in layers from the cold peaks down to the warm valleys, allowed the Inca to grow a great range of crops, each at the height that suited it best. Their farming climbed and descended the mountains like a staircase of different worlds beyond the potato and the maize and the quinoa. The Andes gave a wealth of other foods, many of them little known elsewhere in the world. There were other mountain tubers grown alongside the potato, roots of different colours and flavours that thrived in the high, cold ground. There was a grain of tiny bright seeds and a hardy legume rich in nourishment, and many kinds of squash and beans and peppers that gave warmth and flavour to the daily meals. The Inca also preserved meat as they preserved their potatoes, by drying it in the thin, cold air. Strips of llama meat were dried until they became light and lasting, a preserved food that could be stored for a long time and carried far. The word for this dried meat has itself travelled a great distance across the centuries, and it lives on today in the ordinary word we use for dried strips of meat, a small, quiet echo of the Andes, in kitchens all over the world, in one place, on curving terraces set into great circular hollows in the ground. The Inca seem to have studied their crops with special care. These deep, round terraces created a range of small climates, from top to bottom, warmer below and cooler above, and many believe the Inca used such places to learn how different plants grew at different heights. To bring water to their fields, the Inca built canals and channels, guiding mountain streams and springs across the land to where the crops needed them. In their cities, too, water ran through carved stone channels and fountains, brought from the hills along careful courses. The management of water was another of their quiet arts. The Inca were masters of moving water. They channeled springs and streams through carved stone conduits, guiding fresh water for miles across the land to their fields, their cities, and their sacred places. In their temples and estates, water was made beautiful as well as useful, running through a sequence of carved basins and fountains, falling from one to the next in clear and steady streams. Some of these stone fountains still flow today, fed by the very springs the Inca first tapped, the water sliding down the same channels after all these centuries. To make water run clear and gentle through stone was, for them, both an art and an act of reverence. Among their most prized plants was the coca, whose leaves were chewed to ease hunger, tiredness, and the effects of the thin mountain air. Coca was treated as sacred, used in ceremonies and offerings, and reserved in special ways. It was woven deeply into Andean life, a plant of both the body and the spirit. The empire reached down from the mountains to the sea, and along the dry Pacific coast lived fishing peoples, whose lives were bound to the ocean. They set out upon the water on rafts and reed craft to gather the rich harvest of fish from the cold coastal currents. Larger rafts of light balsa wood, fitted with sails, were used along the coast to carry goods from place to place upon the sea. From the coast came dried fish and shells prized for offerings, and cotton, all drawn up along the roads into the highland heart of the empire. The Inca world stretched from the snow of the peaks to the salt of the sea, and took something from each. Now, the Inca kept animals as well as crops, though their animals were different from those of the old world. They had no cattle, no sheep, no pigs, no horses, and no chickens. Their herds were made of the animals of the mountains, the llama and its smaller cousin, the alpaca. High above the farmed valleys lay the cold, open grasslands. The puna, a wide, wind-swept country of tough grass and thin air, where few crops could grow. This was the land of the herders who lived among their llamas and alpacas on the roof of the world, moving the animals across the pale grass beneath enormous skies. It was a hard, quiet, high life, wrapped in wool against the cold, and it gave the empire its herds, its wool, and its sure-footed carriers of burdens. The llama was the great pack animal of the Andes, strong enough to carry loads along the mountain roads, sure-footed on the steep and narrow paths. Caravans of llamas moved goods across the empire, and their ability to carry burdens where wheels could not go was one of the reasons the roads worked at all. The llama gave more than transport. Its wool could be spun, its meat eaten, its hide used, and its dung dried and burned as fuel in a land where firewood was scarce at high altitude. Even the droppings of the llama were valuable, spread on the fields as fertilizer. Little was wasted. The alpaca, smaller than the llama, was prized above all for its wool, soft and warm and fine. Alpaca fleece was spun into thread and woven into cloth of great beauty. In the cold heights of the Andes, warm cloth was not a luxury but a need, and the alpaca helped provide it. There was one more animal of the high mountains that the Inca prized above almost all others, the wild vicuna, a slender cousin of the llama whose fleece is among the softest and finest in the world. The Inca did not keep the vicuna in herds. Instead, from time to time, they held great organized hunts in which many people gathered to drive the wild herds gently together into an enclosure. There the animals were caught, and the vicunas were sheared of their fine wool and then released again to run free upon the mountains. The precious vicuna wool was reserved for the emperor and for the highest purposes, cloth of a softness fit for the son of the sun. It was a hunt that took the wool but spared the animal, and it could be held only now and then, so that the wild herds were never exhausted. The Inca also kept the guinea pig, a small animal raised for food. Guinea pigs were kept in and around houses, easy to feed on scraps and greens, and eaten on special occasions. They were also used in healing ceremonies and in offerings. This small creature was a quiet part of everyday Andean life. The daily food of most people was simple and mostly of the earth. They ate potatoes and other tubers, maize and quinoa, beans and squash and peppers, often cooked together into hearty stews and soups warmed. Over a small hearth, meat was not an everyday thing for ordinary families. It came mainly at festivals, or now and then from the guinea pigs kept about the house, saved for special days. It was a plain diet, but a nourishing one, drawn from the terraced fields and well suited to the cold and the heights, the food of a hard-working mountain people. But of all the crafts of the Inca, none was valued more highly than the making of cloth. To the Inca, fine textiles were among the most precious things in the world, more precious in some ways than gold. Cloth was given as a gift by the emperor, offered to the gods, and even burned in sacrifice. The finest cloth of all was a tightly woven textile called kumbi, made by skilled weavers from the softest wool, often in brilliant colors and intricate patterns. Kumbi cloth was reserved for the highest purposes, for the emperor and the gods. A fabric so fine it stood among the greatest treasures of the empire. Weaving was done on simple looms, and yet the results were extraordinary in their fineness and their color. The patterns woven into Andean cloth carried meaning, marking rank and region and belonging. To wear certain cloth was to show who you were and where you stood. The empire could almost be read in its textiles. The weavers of the Andes worked with simple tools, often a loom tied at one end to a post, or a tree, and at the other to a belt around the weaver's own waist, so that the tension was held by the body as she leaned gently back and forth. From such humble looms came cloth of extraordinary fineness and colour. Their colours were drawn from the living world around them, deep reds made from a tiny insect that lives upon a desert cactus, blues from a plant, and yellows and browns and greens from many roots and leaves, all fixed into the wool and cotton as brilliant and lasting dyes. Some cloth was even worked with the bright feathers of tropical birds, carried up from the distant forests, so that it seemed to shimmer like a living thing. Into the finest cloth, the weavers set rows of small square patterns, each a design of its own, arranged in careful bands and sequences. These patterns carried meaning, marking rank and office and belonging, and some believe they came close to a kind of writing, a quiet language of woven signs. The Inca, who could not read a page, could still read a garment. Now, let us turn to the stone, for the Inca were among the greatest builders. in stone the world has ever known, and their walls still stand as testimony to their skill. They built without iron tools and without the wheel, and yet they shaped stone with breathtaking precision. The most famous of their stonework is made of great blocks fitted together so tightly that no mortar was needed between them. The stones were cut and shaped to match one another exactly, their edges meeting so closely that it is often said a blade of grass or a knife cannot be slipped into the joints. These stones were not simple squares. Many were cut into complex shapes with many sides and angles, each block fitting perfectly against its neighbors like a puzzle of stone. Some famous blocks have a dozen corners or more, locking into the stones around them in a way that is both beautiful and immensely strong. This careful stonework had a great practical value in the Andes, where earthquakes are common. The tightly fitted stones could shift slightly and settle back into place when the ground shook, so that Inca walls often survived earthquakes that toppled later buildings. Their architecture was made to move gently and endure. The Inca favored a particular shape in their finest buildings, a trapezoid, wider at the bottom than at the top. Their doorways, their windows, and their wall niches were often built in this trapezoidal form, leaning slightly inward. It gave their buildings stability, and it became a signature of their style, recognizable across the empire. Above the city of Cusco stood a great complex of walls we now call Sacsayhuaman, built of some of the largest stones the Inca ever moved. Some of these stones are enormous, weighing many tons, and yet they were fitted together with the same astonishing precision. As the smallest wall, how the Inca moved and placed such gigantic stones without iron tools, without the wheel, without draft animals strong enough to haul them, remains a source of wonder. It was done with ramps, levers, ropes, sledges, and the organized labor of many people, patience and human effort shaping the mountains into walls. The great walls of Sacsayhuaman were built in a striking zigzag, 3 terraced walls rising one above another in a long line of jutting angles, so that they resembled a row of teeth or a bolt of lightning frozen in stone. If the city below was truly imagined as a puma, some said these zigzag walls formed the great cat's teeth. Whatever the meaning, the effect was mighty. a fortress and temple of angled stone crowning the hill above Cusco, where great ceremonies were held beneath the open sky. Down in the sacred valley below Cusco stood other great sites, such as the terraces and temples of Ollantaytambo, where huge stones were somehow carried up a mountainside and set in place. These were royal estates and strongholds and holy places, built where the mountains and rivers met. And highest and most famous of all, set on a narrow ridge between two peaks, high above a curving river, stood the place we now call Machu Picchu. It was a royal estate and sanctuary, built in the time of Pachacuti, a city of stone terraces and temples perched among the clouds. Machu Picchu was never a great capital, and it seems to have been used for only a short time before it was abandoned and quietly forgotten. Hidden high in the mountains, wrapped in cloud forest, it escaped the notice of the outside world for centuries, until it was brought again to wide attention in modern times. Its stones still stand, terraced against the sky. Within Machu Picchu stood temples and shrines of finely fitted stone, and among them a carved stone rising from the living rock, connected to the watching of the sun, a kind of stone marker of the turning year. There was a curved temple whose windows aligned with the rising sun at the turning points of the seasons, and a chamber with 3 windows looking out over the mountains, and long stairways and channels that carried clean water from a spring down through the site to a series of small stone fountains. Everything was set with care into the shape of the ridge, so that the buildings seemed to grow out of the mountain itself rather than to be set upon it. The city of Cusco itself was the sacred heart of everything, and it was laid out with great care. It is often said that the Inca shaped the plan of Cusco in the form of a puma, the great mountain cat, with the fortress of Sacsayhuaman as its head. The city was not merely built, it was imagined as a living sacred form. At the center of Cusco stood the most sacred building of the empire, the great temple of the sun, known as the Coricancha. Its name is often understood to mean the golden enclosure, and it was said to have been covered and filled with gold, gleaming in the mountain light. The walls of the Coricancha were said to be lined with plates of gold. Within it, some accounts describe a garden of gold and silver, with images of plants, animals, and figures worked in precious metal. a shimmering artificial garden made to honor the sun. It was one of the wonders of the empire. Within the golden temple, it is said, hung a great image of the sun worked in gold, catching the morning light as it entered. So bright and precious were the treasures of that temple that stories were told of them long after they were gone, carried off and melted down in the empire's fall. The golden garden, the sheets of gold upon the walls, the shining image of the sun, all passed away, and only the fitted stone foundations of the great temple remained to show where such splendor had once stood. From the great temple of the sun in Cusco, the Inca imagined a web of sacred lines radiating outward across the land, reaching toward the horizon in many directions. Along these lines were arranged the countless holy places of the valley, the springs and stones and shrines, each tended in its turn by a particular group of people according to a sacred calendar. In this way, the whole landscape around the capital was bound into a single vast web of the sacred, centered upon the temple of the sun, ordered like the spokes of a great wheel. To the Inca, gold and silver were sacred, but not as money, for they did not use them to buy and sell. Gold was associated with the sun and was sometimes called the sweat of the sun. Silver was associated with the moon and was sometimes called the tears of the moon. These metals were for the gods and the emperor, matters of the sacred, not the market. The Inca and the peoples before them were skilled workers of metal, though never of iron, which they did not use. They worked gold and silver into ornaments and sacred objects, and they made tools and blades of copper and of bronze, a harder metal made by mixing copper with tin or other metals. A curved knife with a wide crescent blade was among their forms, used in ceremony and in daily work alike. Much of their finest metalwork was made not for use, but for beauty and for the sacred. Gleaming images and vessels and ornaments for the temples and for the nobility. The nobles of the empire wore large ornaments in their ears, discs and spools set into stretched earlobes, so striking that the later Spanish gave the noble class a nickname, meaning the big-eared ones. To wear such ornaments was to show high rank, a mark of standing carried upon the body itself. When the Spanish later melted down the treasures of the empire, an incalculable amount of beautiful gold work was lost forever, turned into plain and lifeless bars. What little survived gives only a glimpse of how the temples and palaces of the Inca must once have shone in the clear mountain sun. Now we come to the gods of the Inca and to the sky, for their religion was woven through everything, through the sun and the moon, the mountains and the earth, the ancestors and the stars. The world of the Inca was a sacred world, full of holy places and watchful powers. Above all shone Inti, the sun god, from whom the emperor himself was believed to descend. The sun gave warmth and light and made the crops grow, and it was honored above the other gods in the state religion. The great temple of Cusco was his, and his festivals were the grandest of the year. There was also a great creator god, often called Viracocha, imagined as the maker of the world, of the sun and moon and stars, and of the first people. In some tellings, Viracocha rose from Lake Titicaca to make the world, then walked across the land, teaching, and finally departed across the sea, promising, some said, to return one day. Lake Titicaca, from which the first Inca was said to have come, remained one of the most sacred places in all the empire. On an island within the lake, it was said, the sun itself had first risen into the sky at the beginning of the world, and so the island was honored as a holy birthplace of light. Pilgrims journeyed to its shrines across the deep blue water. The people of the lake lived, in part, upon the water itself. From the tall reeds that grew in the shallows, they made boats, bundling the dried reeds together into graceful, curved craft that floated upon the lake. From those same reeds, some built floating islands to live upon, layering the reeds thickly enough to walk and to build small houses on, drifting gently upon the surface. This way of living upon the reeds of the lake has lasted, in places, into the present day. The earth itself was honored as a goddess, Pachamama, the earth mother, the giver of crops and the ground beneath all life. Offerings were made to her at planting and harvest, and drink was poured onto the soil in her honor. She was close and constant, the mother underfoot. The moon was honored as a goddess too, often called Mama Killa, the mother moon, wife or sister of the sun. She governed the passing of time, the months and the festivals, and her cycles helped order the calendar. Silver was her metal, the pale tears of the moon. The thunder and the weather had their own god, often called Ilapa, who was believed to bring the rain. He was imagined striking a jar of water in the sky or cracking a sling, so that the thunder was his crack and the rain his water spilling down. In a farming world, the god of rain was a god of life. The Inca imagined the cosmos as divided into layered worlds. There was the world above, the realm of the sun and moon and the sky gods. There was the world here, the ordinary world of the living, of people and animals and growing things. And there was the world below, the inner world of the dead and the depths of the earth. These layers were sometimes linked to three sacred animals in Andean thought: the condor, the great mountain bird, belonged to the world above. The puma, the mountain cat, belonged to the world of the living, and the serpent belonged to the world below. Bird, cat, and snake, sky, earth, and underground. The Inca saw the sacred not only in their great gods, but in countless places across the land, which they called huacas. A huaca might be a mountain peak, a spring, a strange rock, a cave, a shrine, or an object of special power. The whole landscape was dotted with these sacred places, each honored in its own way. The high mountains themselves were among the greatest of the sacred powers, honored as mighty spirits watching over the land. The snow-capped peaks were living presences to the Inca, sources of water and weather, guardians and gods. To live among such mountains was to live among the divine. The Inca honored their dead with great care, and especially their royal ancestors. The bodies of dead emperors were preserved as mummies, and these mummies were not hidden away, but kept, honored, and treated almost as if still living. The royal mummies were dressed in fine cloth, brought out for festivals, offered food and drink, and consulted as if they could still give counsel. A dead emperor kept his palace, his servants, and his lands, and his mummy presided over them. The ancestors remained present among the living, honored members of the family and the state. This honoring of the royal dead shaped the empire in a deep and curious way. When an emperor died, his mummy was not stripped of his wealth. Instead, his palaces, his lands, his servants, and his treasures remained his, kept and managed by his descendants as a kind of household of the dead that endured for generations. The dead emperor went on owning what he had owned in life. This meant that each new emperor inherited the throne, but not the riches of his father, for those stayed with the father's mummy and lineage. A new Sapa Inca had to win his own wealth, his own lands, his own estates, and so each new ruler was pressed to conquer fresh territory, to build his own greatness rather than to rest upon what came before. Some have seen in this custom one of the quiet engines of the empire's swift and restless expansion, a hunger for new land built into the very way the Inca honored their dead. Ordinary people too preserved and honored their ancestors, keeping the remains of the dead in special places and bringing them offerings. The dry air and cold of parts of the Andes helped preserve these bodies. To the Inca, the line between the living and the dead was not a wall, but a kind of continuing relationship. Among the most solemn and sobering of Inca practices was a rare and sacred offering made at times of great importance, such as the death of an emperor or a moment of crisis. In this ceremony, chosen children were taken to the summits of the highest mountains and offered to the gods. These children were treated as sacred, honored, and given fine clothing and offerings before the ceremony. On the frozen peaks, some of their bodies remained preserved by the cold and the dry air for centuries, and a few have been found in modern times, still wrapped in their fine cloth, as though sleeping high on the mountains. It is a haunting and sorrowful window into how deeply the Inca believed in their gods and the mountains. Certain young women held a special sacred role in the empire, chosen for their skill and their beauty, and dedicated to service. They were sometimes called the chosen women. They lived apart, weaving the finest cloth, brewing chicha for ceremonies, and serving the temples and the sun. Their work and their lives were given over to the sacred. The Inca watched the sky with great care, for the heavens governed the seasons and the festivals. They tracked the movements of the sun through the year, marking the solstices, the days when the sun reaches its farthest points and turns back again. Knowing these turning points told them when to plant and when to celebrate. They built markers and used the horizon and standing stones to observe the sun's yearly path. In some sacred places stood carved stones connected to the tracking of the sun, and around them the priests could read the turning of the year. The calendar of festivals followed the sky. The Inca watched not only the sun, but the whole of the night sky, and they read it in a way unlike many other peoples, where others drew their pictures by joining the bright stars. The Inca also read the dark spaces, the shadowy patches that run along the glowing band of the night. In those dark shapes against the light of the sky, they saw the forms of animals, a llama, a fox, a toad, a serpent, a whole dark bestiary stretched across the heavens, that glowing band of countless stars, which we call the Milky Way. The Inca, imagined as a great celestial river flowing across the sky, mirroring the rivers that ran through their mountains far below. Sky and earth reflected one another. The heavenly river above and the mountain rivers beneath, and the dark animals of the stars were said to drink from the river of light. The greatest of their festivals was the festival of the sun, held around the time of the winter solstice in the southern mountains in June. It was a grand celebration in honor of Inti, with processions, offerings, feasting, and the drinking of chicha, calling the sun back toward the warmth of the growing season. A version of this festival is still celebrated in Cusco today. The Inca world was not silent. Music ran through its festivals and its labors, played on instruments of a gentle and haunting kind. There were flutes carved from cane and panpipes of many reeds bound side by side, breathed across to make soft, rising and falling notes. There were drums, large and small, and rattles, and trumpets made from shell and from clay. At the great festivals, people sang and danced in long lines and circles, and the sound of the reed pipes drifted across the mountain air. Even work in the fields was often done to singing, the labor of many hands moving together to a shared and steady song. Daily life for most people in the empire was a life of farming, herding, weaving, and labor, lived in villages of stone and thatch scattered across the mountains and valleys. People dressed in woven wool and cotton, in tunics and cloaks and simple sandals, warm against the mountain cold. Homes were often single rooms of stone or mud brick, roofed with thatch, warmed by a small hearth. Families lived close together within their igloo, working shared land, marking the year by planting and harvest and festival. It was a life bound to the seasons and to the community, ordered and rhythmic. Growing up in the empire was marked by its own gentle ceremonies. Children were given a first name in infancy, and later, as they came of age, took on an adult name in a rite of passage. For the young of the nobility especially, the coming into adulthood was marked with solemn ceremony, with tests, with fine new garments, and with the honoring of the ancestors and the gods. Each life moved through its seasons within the ordered world of the Elu and the empire, from childhood to work, to marriage, to old age, held all the while within the community. Marriage and family followed their own customs across the empire. Among ordinary people, a couple might live together for a time before a marriage was made fully binding, a trial by which each learned whether they suited the other. Once settled, the new household took its place within the Elu and shared in its work and its land. The emperor's own marriage followed a different and stricter rule. His principal wife and queen, honored as the Koya, was often his own sister, so that the sacred bloodline of the sun would remain pure and undivided. The Sapa Inca might keep many other wives besides, and a great household of women and children, but the Koya held the highest place, and her son was most likely to inherit the sacred throne. In this way, the family of the sun kept itself apart, wound tightly around its own descent. The people of the Andes had adapted over long ages to life at great heights, where the air holds less breath than it does below. Their bodies were suited to the thin mountain air in ways that let them work and thrive, where lowland visitors would struggle to climb a single hill. They were, in a real sense, a people of the heights. The healers of the Andes had real skill, and among the most striking of their arts was surgery upon the skull. In the Andes, healers performed operations that opened the skull to treat injuries and ailments. And remarkably, many patients survived, their bones showing signs of healing long after the operation. It was delicate and dangerous work, and yet it was done, and done successfully, high in these mountains. The healers of the Andes knew their plants, as well as they knew their surgery. They treated the sick with a great store of herbs and roots and bark, drugs gathered from the mountains, and the forests, remedies for fevers and wounds and pains of every kind. The sacred coca leaf eased hunger and weariness and dulled pain, and was used in healing as well as in ceremony. Much of this deep knowledge of the Andean plants was passed down by word and by practice, healer to healer, and some of it survives among the mountain people even now. The common language of the empire was Quechua, the tongue the Inca spread across their lands as the language of administration and of daily speech. It was carried along the roads with the empire, and it took root widely. Quechua is still spoken today by millions of people across the Andes. A living voice descended from the empire, the sons of the nobility and of conquered lords brought to Cusco were given an education in the capital. Wise teachers instructed them over several years in the things a ruler or an official needed to know. The Quechua language of the empire, its religion and its history, the keeping and reading of the knotted cords, and the ordering of people and provinces. These teachers were keepers of memory and learning, reciting the histories and the sacred stories, holding the past of a people who wrote nothing down. Knowledge in the empire lived in trained human minds, passed from teacher to pupil, spoken and remembered rather than written and shelved. The Inca often moved whole groups of people from one part of the empire to another, resettling them for their own purposes, to spread loyal populations, to work new lands, or to weaken a troublesome region. These resettled communities carried their skills and their labor to where the state wished them to be. It was another tool of a state that counted and arranged its people with great care. At its height, the empire held many millions of people, spread across the mountains and the coasts of a great stretch of a continent, all bound together under the single sacred figure of the Sapa Inca. It was the largest and most organized state the Americas had ever seen, and yet it had grown to this vast size in only a few generations, rising with astonishing speed from a single mountain valley to a realm of thousands of miles. A thing that grows so quickly can also fall quickly. And the empire, for all its roads and storehouses and armies, had stood in its full greatness for less than 100 years when its ending came. Now we come, slowly and gently, to the ending, for even the greatest empires pass. At the height of its power, with its roads and cities and full storehouses. The empire of the Inca met a series of blows that fell within only a few short years. The trouble began, in part, from far away, before the Inca had even seen the strangers who would undo them. A sickness swept down through the Americas ahead of the Europeans themselves, diseases against which the peoples of the Americas had no defense, carried from person to person across the land. This sickness is thought to have reached the Inca and killed great numbers of people, and among the dead, it is believed, was the Emperor Huayna Capac himself, struck down by illness before he had even met a European face. To face, his death left the empire without a clear and settled ruler. The death of the emperor led to a war between two of his sons, two brothers who each claimed the right to rule. Their names were Huascar and Atahualpa, and the empire was torn between them in a bitter civil war. Its armies turned against one another, its unity broken from within. Atahualpa at last defeated his brother and won the war. But the empire he inherited was exhausted and divided, weakened by sickness and by fighting. And it was at exactly this moment, into this weakened and unsettled land, that the strangers came. A small band of Spanish soldiers, led by Francisco Pizarro, had arrived on the coast and made their way up into the mountains. They were very few in number, only a couple of hundred men, but they carried steel weapons, armor, horses, and firearms, none of which the Inca had ever faced. In the highland town of Cajamarca, the Spanish met the Emperor Atahualpa, who came to them with a great retinue, confident and unafraid, for the strangers were so few. But in a sudden and violent ambush, the Spanish seized the emperor himself, capturing the living son of the sun in the midst of his own people. Holding the emperor captive, the Spanish demanded an enormous ransom for his release. It is said that Atahualpa offered to fill a room once with gold and twice with silver in exchange for his freedom, and the people of the empire brought the treasure, stripping gold from temples and palaces, filling the room as promised. The ransom was gathered, a staggering fortune in gold and silver, melted down by the Spanish into bars. But the emperor was not freed. In the end, having taken the ransom, the Spanish put Atahualpa to death. The living god of the empire was gone, and with him much of the empire's heart. With the capture of the capital and the fall of the ruling family, the Spanish took control of Cusco and set up a ruler of their own choosing. The great empire that had risen so swiftly began to come apart, its temples stripped, its order broken, its gods challenged by the newcomers and their faith. The conquest was not the work of a small band of Spanish soldiers alone. Many peoples within the empire had chafed under the rule of Cusco, and when the strangers came, some of these peoples joined them, hoping to throw off their Inca masters. It was with many thousands of native allies that so few Spaniards were able to overcome so vast an empire, nor did the Inca surrender quietly. A prince named Manco Inca, whom the Spanish had at first set up as a puppet ruler, turned against them and raised a great rebellion, gathering an enormous army and laying siege to Cusco itself, trying to drive the strangers back toward the sea. Fierce fighting swept across the sacred city and the fortress of Sacsayhuaman above it. For a time, the outcome hung in doubt. But in the end, the rebellion could not retake the city, and Manco Inca withdrew into the mountains to continue the struggle from there. Yet the Inca did not vanish all at once. Some of the royal family withdrew into the remote mountains to a refuge called Vilcabamba, deep in the rugged country beyond Cusco. There, for some years, a line of Inca rulers held out, keeping something of the old empire alive in the wild highlands. In the end, this last refuge too was overcome, and the final independent Inca ruler was captured and put to death, closing the long story of the empire's sovereignty. The age of the Sapa Inca, the sons of the sun, came to its end in the high green mountains, where it had begun. But an empire is more than its rulers, and much of the Inca world did not die. The Quechua language lives on in the mouths of millions. The terraces still climb the mountainsides. Some still farmed. The potato, first grown by Andean hands, feeds much of the world today. The great grass bridge is still woven and rebuilt each year. The festival of the sun is still celebrated in Cusco. The stone walls still stand, still fitting so tightly that no blade can pass between them. Still standing through the earthquakes that shake the mountains. The empire fell, but the Andes remember it in 1,000 quiet ways. You can still see the meeting of the two worlds most plainly in Cusco itself. When the Spanish took the city, they pulled down the temple of the sun and built a church upon its foundations. But the Inca stonework was so strong that they could not easily remove it, and so the old walls still stand beneath. And within the newer building, when great earthquakes later struck the city and cracked the colonial walls above, the ancient Inca foundations held firm, unmoved, exactly as their builders had intended. And far beyond the mountains, the quiet gifts of the Andes spread across the whole world. The potato, carried across the ocean, became one of the most important foods on earth, feeding nations that had never heard the name of the Inca. The words for many Andean things, the llama, the condor, the puma, the grain quinoa, passed into the languages of distant peoples. An empire that kept no writing left its mark. In the end, upon the tongues and the tables of people everywhere. And so we come back down gently from the high, thin air, from the roads and the terraces and the golden temple, from the mountains that were themselves gods. We leave the runners resting at their posts and the mummies sleeping in their fine cloth, and the great stones standing silent above the clouds. There is no need to hold on to any of it now. Let the names soften. Let the mountains fade into distance. Let the empire settle back into the quiet where it has rested for so long. The mist is drifting through the peaks. It moves along the terraces. It gathers in the valleys where the rivers run. The stone is cool now. The air is still. The high fields lie quiet under the passing cloud. Somewhere, a condor turns slowly on the wind. Somewhere, a llama rests among the grass. Somewhere, the old roads wait, empty, in the dark. The fire is low. The mountains are old and patient and kind. Let the mind grow quiet. Let the thin air carry you. Let the last of the day dissolve. Mist on the terraces, stone upon stone, moonlight on the high peaks. Stillness now, rest.